Want to come?
No,
I can see you.
you're gonna use the slides?
I will. You want it? Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining today's EduTalk. So as you know that the topic is quite relevant, important as well as controversial. So we are with the experts here who will be speaking more about that. But first intro, we have Sam Wilson, the director of Pakistan Foundational Learning Hub. It's a unit in Ministry of Federal Education and Professional Training. We also have Ms. Zainab Salim here. She is the research associate at the Pakistan Foundational Learning Hub. Sam has masters in educational development and policy from University of Leeds. Before joining the Ministry of Federal Education and Pakistan Foundation Learning Hub, he worked on COVID-19 response under the Overseas Development Institute Fellow. Ms. Zainab Salim has also worked with UNICEF and other leading organizations. Her research interest includes teacher training development, professional development, and decision making. We really hope that this session gets very engaging, and it's always open towards students for questions, but be mindful that the questions should be asked in a very respectful manner. Yes, starting from here. So, Sam, if you can tell us a bit about when you were choosing the topic, why, like, what was the motivation and reason behind choosing this talk, and specifically about, government level research? And do government actually care about research, or is it just symbolic?
Thank you so much. I should say thank you so much. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. It's a real pleasure, just before I start on your difficult and challenging question, but just to say it's a real pleasure for us to be here. Thank you so much to the School of Education, to Dr. Tayyiba, who I finally had the pleasure to meet in person. So it's great to be here. It's great to meet you face to face, Fatima. We've been exchanging a lot of ideas over the last few months. And it's a real pleasure for us to have the opportunity to speak to all of you guys. We sometimes introduced as experts, but we're just basically people trying to do our best, trying to figure out the way to impact the government through research. So what I really hope from this session is that we can share a bit of our experience in working with the government, but also answer a lot of your questions, what you might think, how you would influence the government in that way, or what you might want to get from potentially engaging with the government in the future as researchers or as educational leaders, which I'm guessing you will all go on to become. So yeah, to your question a bit more broadly, Fatima, why did I want to talk about this, or why did we want to talk about this? Other than perhaps the opportunity to just kind of release our collective trauma, I think it's probably, for us, almost the most important question for our work. So maybe I can just go back a little bit and introduce the role of the hub and kind of what it does and what we're set up to do, and then maybe give you an idea of kind of why this question is relevant. We're basically a small team, and we're sat within the Federal Ministry of Education. So we're a unit of the Federal Ministry. And we're kind of, as I was explaining just now, we're kind of a bit of an experiment. There's not usually a small team of researchers attached to federal ministries whose job it is to kind of examine the research and feed that into government. That sort of function doesn't really exist. So we've been trying to sort of set up as a way to say, okay, why are children in Pakistan not getting the basics of foundational learning? So as I'm sure all of you know, and all of you have studied, 4 out of 5 children in this country can't read by the age of 10, right? So essentially, why is that the case? What should the government do about it? And can we as researchers and academics understand that problem better and work closely with the policymakers where we're sat to try and give them some good solutions to improve the situation? So we're set up in response to the learning crisis, number one, and then number two, to try and get the evidence around these things into policy. Now, as we'll discuss a bit more in our talk, you would have thought that perhaps that's an obvious thing, that the government would need the evidence on why the learning crisis exists. And we've got a bunch of solutions, and hey presto, you just use the solutions, and problem solved, right? But it's not solved, right? If 4 out of 5 children aren't reading, then it's not. So we're there to try and get that evidence into policy. We have about 4 or 5 people in our team. Some of them are here today. We've got Amna and Cheyenne and Alberto also here. So hopefully these guys can field some of your more difficult questions. And Dr. Zainab, obviously. But basically, we have a bit of a research team, and the research team conducts things like evaluations of the government program. So Zainab's going to tell you a bit more about an evaluation we did actually of a government program and what that experience was like. And then we have a policy team whose job is to work more closely with the policies that the government have got and help them to implement those or apply research more directly to those policies and with those policymakers. And finally, sorry, long-winded way of saying to your question, as you can see, our job is to get evidence on this problem, the learning crisis, into policy. So a central question we're always asking is, how do we do that? How do we get the government to really listen to what this research is saying? Or how do we design research or conduct research in a way that it's actually demanded or addressing a need that the government really wants? So that's the kind of motivation behind this question. And I think it's probably not just us. I'm sure that the School of Education has similar thoughts a lot of the time, right? How can all of the amazing research that is produced in a school like this, with so many experts and professors, well, if there's so many bright people and so much knowledge and expertise, then how is the government still struggling, right? How do we still at the problem if the knowledge is here, if the expertise is here, if the research is here, and why is nothing changing, right? So I think it's kind of, we wanted a problem to give you a question or problem, not just for us, but hopefully really relevant to you as academics and researchers, because I think it's a problem for all of us to get evidence in that way. So sorry, that's a long-winded way, but.
Yeah, so leading to that, the two words I really wanted to get into deeper, right? The first is evidence, right? And the second is like we have so many talented people who actually want to do research.
Yeah.
But there is a hindrance, kind of, I would say, a red tape or bureaucratic hierarchies, or things that if a person has love for research and they really want to have that intellectual rigor and that freedom, but again, when they go into reality, so what strikes the most then?
Sure.
So
Sure. So I've got a little bit of a talk. Maybe if I can kind of like talk through it a bit for sort of 10, 15 minutes, give you some of the kind of headline points of that. I think it addresses some of those points. And what we might do, if it's all right with you, is then sort of have a few questions. I think we've got a little bit of time to have a few questions on based on that. And then I might hand over to Zainab, who's going to talk through in a bit more detail what it was like us evaluating a particular program in the government. So you'll get from Zainab more an idea of what's going on the research side, and from me maybe a bit of an idea of kind of working with the government. Is that all right? So I'll just like go through this a little bit, and I think I'll answer your points as part of that. So do governments care about research? It's quite a controversial, provocative title. I'm sorry, it's a little bit clickbaity, but it is a big question for us, right? What I want to do is very briefly talk you through, if you were in our position and you've got to go and you've got to take your research or your evidence to the government and engage with them, I want to give you 3 challenges that we think you'll come up against, okay? And talk you through a little bit about why that might be. I want to give you 3 solutions or opportunities for how we might go about solving that, or you might go about solving those issues. And then 3 ideas for the future of what, as researchers, we can do to better engage with the government. So the gloomy stuff first, right? Okay, it's not easy getting research and evidence into policy, okay? Now, why is that? Point number 1. One thing is that the government, and this is the same from our government as it is for yours, but the government is often thought of as just one entity, right? First mistake. It's not. It's described as an archipelago of different things, right? You've got different ministries, you've got different people in every ministry, you've got different secretaries in every ministry, you've got different politicians, all with different incentives and interests, right? And then not only is it not just one thing in one place in one ministry, but it's always in flux, right? People keep coming, going, governments change. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of the politics of Pakistan and lots of other countries, but things change pretty fast, right? Which means that also senior leadership in these places change really fast. Let me give you an example, right? So between 2013 and 2021 in Baluchistan, there were 13 different secretaries of education. Okay, so Secretary of Education, for anyone who doesn't know, is the most senior civil servant official in the school, in the education department. So the most senior official in charge of all the education in Baluchistan was changing on average every 8 months. Now, imagine how difficult it is, right? If you're a researcher and you've got evidence, okay, right, I want to do something about improving teaching in Baluchistan, TK, right, okay, let's go. Let's give you this big program. Let's launch it. Let's get the money involved. Let's get the planning involved, everything. And then he just goes, right? The leadership just goes. So that fluidity is a real challenge. During our experience, and I got to slightly careful what I say here, but during our experience, when we were set up by one particular Secretary of Education with a certain set of priorities, we're now on our third Secretary of Education, right? So the priorities under which we were set up and we had our motivation have shifted during our tenure. Now, that then has implications a bit about what you do about it, which I can talk about. But that's a particular challenge when you're trying to get evidence in place. The second challenge is that the policy cycle, which I'm sure that you study and know very well, in its theoretical form, isn't really in place here, right? So classic, how would you set up a policy, right? Common sense would suggest, number one, identify the problem, okay? For example, children are not learning to read in Pakistan. Okay, why is that? And then we explore the problem, okay? Number two, you move to, okay, what might the potential solutions be? Let's explore the evidence. What are the solutions? Number three, let's test them out. Okay. All right. Okay. Maybe they need more books, or teacher training needs to improve, or maybe they lack internet connection. Whatever it is, you get a solution and you test it out. Try it in a couple of schools, 10 schools, 15 schools, 50 schools. Okay. Then you get your measurements, and then okay, this worked, this didn't, and then you scale it up. Right. Okay. That cycle of things is not necessarily in play in this reality. Okay. Part of the reason for that is, there's many reasons, but part of the reason is that there are quite political reasons why that is not necessarily the case, right? So the actual decision what to research, or sorry, what the intervention is going to be is not necessarily based on the problem, right? So, for example, we might turn up at a ministry and say, well, you need to get more books in place because this is the problem we've identified is a lack of foundational learning. And one must say, well, that's not our priority. Our priority is different because our priority isn't governed by an identification of the problems. It's governed by political priorities. So you're not solving the right solution necessarily. I'm not saying this isn't always the case, but so the politicization of decision making affects the whole policy cycle, and that affects the role of evidence, right? Because you then don't need evidence if you're not trying to get necessarily those outcomes. So yeah, I've got more to say on that, but for the sake of time, I'll skip forward a little bit. And then the third challenge that you might come up against, and this is related to the second, is that the goal of an education department sometimes is not the delivery of outcomes. You would have thought, right, that the essential goal of some education departments is to identify your problems, as I said, and then say, okay, we're going to improve teacher training in this way, we're going to improve learning in this way, we're going to get more children into school in this way. And then we're going to go about and focus on delivering on those goals and actions. Now, if the education department is not focused on delivering those outcomes, then its entire function becomes different, right? If the purpose of the education system as a whole is not the delivery of those outcomes, then your role as a researcher changes, right? Does that make sense? So maybe I can kind of give you an example in a little second. But like, if you were to go to a ministry and say, well, we've got this evidence, we're going to solve this learning crisis. They might say, okay, well, that's great. We'll listen to you. We'll listen to your policy brief. We'll listen to your presentation and so on, right? But the fundamental goal of that education system might be actually, improving higher education. So the core purpose of the whole sector is different from what you're approaching it. So I won't drag it out, but essentially you've got some real challenges in the fundamental making of the system. That means that the appetite and demand for you as a researcher who turns up with your evidence might be affected, right? You might not actually get a very warm reception because the system doesn't necessarily need you, okay? Its purpose and its functions don't require the evidence that you're producing. Now, that's the gloomy bit. Let's flick on something a bit more positive, and then I'll answer a few questions. However, okay, there are ways in which you can work even within a really challenging system and actually impact it, improve children's outcomes, and hopefully get your research listened to or your evidence listened to a bit more closely. 3 things that we've got that we learned during our experience, and I'm sure there are yourselves and your professors know these very well, but it's a learning for us. Number 1, even though education ministries as a whole, and particularly in Pakistan, are very hierarchical, it really matters who's at the top, right? And they're all, as it were, a completely different brain. So if you change the secretary, you change the brain, you change the entire body of the ministry. Even though that focus on individuals could be seen very negatively in terms of its sort of institutional sustainability, it does then mean if you get a good brain, right, that you can impact that. So focusing and finding individuals who are champions of reform doesn't happen all the time, happens occasionally. It might happen in different bits of the ministry, but you can focus on those people. An interesting thing that we found is that over time, our relationships with the slightly mid-layer, not the top people, those people slightly lower down tend to stay around for longer. So they're there for like 2 or 3 years, maybe even longer. For example, Amna here and we've been working in Sindh. We did a collaboration with the government of Sindh. They have launched a foundational learning policy, and they said, we don't know which materials to use for our kids. We want you to review all of the materials. So go out there, tell us which books children should read in Sindhi and Urdu and so on and so forth. We were like, great, that's awesome. That's exactly what we were set up to do. We'd love to do that for you. But that only came about because we had a good relationship with the chief curriculum advisor in the government of Sindh. And I've known that person for 3 or 4 years. Now, 3 or 4 years is golden in the government. If you know someone 3 or 4 years and they're in the same position, that's amazing, right? The institutional memory that person has is great. The relationships that you can build is great. So, but she's not the top person in the ministry, but she's stuck around. And so that relationship has opened up a huge amount of access for quality evidence into that ministry at that time. There's another example in FDE, but I'll leave Zainab to talk about that a little bit more. So number 1, champions. Number 2, can you look for alignment between what you're researching and your priorities as a researcher and what the government is interested in? Now, this may feel a bit strange, perhaps, if you're in a university environment. I know, like, when I was studying, I had very clear ideas on, these are the essential things that research should be focused on. These are the topics that we should all be focused on. And I totally understand that, and I'm not devalidating that at all. But when you want to have an impact with the government and you're working really closely with them and you want to have research impact with them, you might want to look for the crossover point between what you're interested in and what they're interested in. Doesn't mean you have to do everything that they want you to do. It just means that there might be overlap sometimes, and you want to be acute to that. It might be overlap in terms of the topic that you researched. So, for example, our focus was foundational learning. We had a particular leader who wasn't so interested in that, but was more interested in early childhood education. So we were like, all right, well, we'll focus on that. That's almost aligned within our area. It feeds into foundational learning, but it's a priority for him, and he's going to back it, and he's going to support it, and the whole ministry will support it as well. So, all right. Like, we'll do a bit of focus on that, and then Zainab can talk a bit more about that. It might also be not just in terms of topic, it might be in the way that you conduct your research, right? There's less appetite for extensive theoretical research, obviously, in the government. They don't necessarily be like, what is this? Like, what am I going to do with that? But there is appetite for things like evaluations, for implementation science, for looking at a policy and saying, okay, why isn't this working? How do I improve it, right? So the way and the type of thing that you're conducting might better suit or better align with what their priorities are. The third thing, the third opportunity, and I'll come to a close pretty soon, but is to look for timing. I'm sure that you're familiar with the sort of theory around windows of opportunity, right? And it's a bit like the people. There might be it might be a difficult system to work in, right? But there might be people who shine as somebody that you can really have a good relationship with and impact with your research, right? But as well as people, there's also timing, okay? When I first came to Pakistan, I was an advisor on education technology because I came from something called the EdTech Hub, which is a big research organization. And the ministry needed advice on education technology. Why? Because it was 2021 and it was COVID, right? All the schools were closed, right? So suddenly we went from EdTech Hub, went from being a sort of small, slightly geeky team of people talking about education technology to the most like in-demand research organization anywhere because schools were closed and there was 1 point however many billion children out of school, right? So there's an opportunity there. Maybe it's sort of to impact that process. The same with the 2022 floods here, right? There was researchers in ODI who'd been doing research on how to rebuild education systems in emergencies. Suddenly that became super, super relevant when 33 million people in Pakistan were affected by the floods, right? So there are times in which government really, really need the evidence that you can supply and produce. And looking for those timings is really important. So that's hopefully a bit less gloomy. Just to conclude then, 3 ideas that I think from our experience that might be worth thinking about. And that don't happen perhaps maybe nearly as much, which is why I want to just end on this note. One is that can we start thinking about ways to link evidence or link the research that we're doing or, to actual existing innovations that the government can use? This is something that I want to explore a bit more. A really good example, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the targeted instruction Pakistan or the TIP project that Tahir and Jabi and others have done. It's not just research on an existing program. It's research that is tied to an actual intervention, an innovation, in this case, 40 days booster training, 40 days remedial learning, right? So he has the evidence on the one hand, but he's actually got an intervention that he's done in 200,000 schools in KP and in Islamabad. So the government looks at that and says, hey, not only does this work, but I know it works because I've done it in my schools with my teachers. And so the ownership of that evidence tied to the intervention is very strong. A little bit of what we're based on, it's worth looking up if you guys are interested, this thing called EdLabs. So we consider ourselves in the hub as something called an EdLab, but it's an innovation lab tied to government, but that's actually quite common all around the world. So we're quite closely working with an EdLab in Peru. And what that does in the Ministry of Education in Peru is research on particular innovations. So somebody might come and say, I've got an innovation to do phonics in the government. I want to try it out. And then these guys will come in and measure that and evaluate it. And then they help the government with scaling it. Second thing that you can do, try and be politically informed as a politically informed researcher. There's a really good piece, if you've read here, he's called Stefan Durkon. He did a really nice piece for something called the What Works Hub about this. But are there ways in which you can potentially package things around your research that make them potentially more politically salient? So I'll give you a little example. There is now in every foundational learning policy in Pakistan, something called a reading hour or a happy learning hour or a happy hour, I think is McDonald's, but I don't know if it's called the happy hour, but it's called something like that. But that came from essentially research, right, that said that there's not enough time in the school day for children to read. Okay, that's what the evidence was telling us. And then some smart person came up and said, okay, that's a boring story to tell a policymaker. You say, oh, sir, there's not enough time to do something in the school day. They'll be like, oh, what do you want me to do about it, right? Like, oh, I'll do this. What's more politically appetizing for a minister is if you say, sir, I got an idea for you, right? Happy reading hour. It'd be great. You launch it, we'll do a big banner. Yeah, we'll celebrate it. Balloons that say happy learning hour on the back of it, okay? Great. They love it, okay? So there's smart ways to take sensible academic changes that you need, but think about the environment in which, you know, and honestly, I can be rude about the politicians and criticize them, but you have to go one step further and think about the incentives and think about the constraints on them a bit more, right? If you're a minister, you might have a limited time in the job, you might have a limited space of time, and you've got to prove your worth and prove your value to your chief minister, right? So help them, give them a hand. Say, we'll do you a launch, we'll do the happy learning hour or whatever it is, right? And so being politically informed might get you a little bit further. And then the final thing is just the basic stuff. Like our experience has been that actually you can engage with the government. I think people sometimes have very bad experiences, and that's understandable. But our experience is they are very open and receptive if you can approach in a sort of sympathetic way, if you can build strong relationships with certain key people, if you can communicate in a way that's clear, that's simple, that is direct, if you can try and align and help with their programming as opposed to sort of give them a great preaching lesson about what they should be doing, if you can just get alongside, actually our experience has been that for the most part, government can be quite receptive to it. So I'll stop there and maybe take a few questions for a bit before handing over. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sam. So do we have questions at this time from the audience? Yes. Also, if I may build upon what Fatma has just said, so is the like government commission research is whether the just rubber stamp or I would say like who benefits from the evidences or research, and even if there is intervention being done. So what's the ultimate, I would ask?
It's super imperfect. I think to your point, sorry, what was your name? Fatma. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a danger for that happening in some of the provinces for the reading out, exactly the same. Because yeah, you have a high level launch of a particular policy idea, and then you don't back it up with the implementation. That's a real danger. I think I think that's a slightly separate challenge, if you see what I mean. Like, it's step one, it's good to have an idea there at all, right? Okay. Step two is that, yes, you really need to build the capacity of the ministries or the departments then to implement it, without doubt. Something that, like, so our experience with where we've come in, particularly with the reading hour, right, is that it was launched. So we had a federal policy launch that launched the reading hour in all Islamabad schools. The reason that I don't think that is happening in Islamabad schools is particularly due to certain leaders who've taken real possession of it and ownership of it, right? And then where we've tried to help is to actually, you then need a lot of support around what books are you going to use, what teachers going to use, all that kind of stuff. So it doesn't, I'm not saying that it solves everything, right? I'm not saying that it's necessarily going to make an intervention completely functional and work, but I am saying that it's going to potentially have an idea that is championed by a policymaker that might be better than the distribution of iPads. You know what I mean? Like the range of things that they could be choosing, at least they're focusing on something good. And then you can come in and you can try and get support and you can try and make the intervention work, but at least get the right ideas on the table first. You know what I mean? So I think both are important. To your point about what was it sort of what's the end goal of the research, or like who actually uses it in the end and stuff like that. It depends, right? I mean, like, you would wish that everyone is listening to us very carefully and then changing their minds, and the whole government listens to the Pakistan Foundational Learning Hub and changes, but it's obviously not the case. Again, I think it depends a lot, unfortunately, on personalities. So like I was saying in this example, right? If you have somebody who actually wants to do it, the reading out, for example, in FDE, you have a very driven person there who is determined to do it. Then if you do research, like Zainab has done a lot of research on improving the reading hour, right? Then you have the receptive audience for it at the end, and actually that improved. So some of Zainab's research was looking at improving teacher training in the reading hour, right? And then we all sat down with that policymaker and said, this is how you need to improve. You need to give more phonics training, you need to do more maths and so on. They've now trained over 1,000 teachers in Islamabad with 4 days worth of phonics training, right? Because you have the receptive person at the end. That's not always the case. So it's very imperfect and it depends on the person. Yeah.
Um, yes. Maybe use mic.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, my question is, how do we not be biased when searching, when choosing something to research upon? For instance, in especially third world countries, research is usually done after a policy is made in order to back that policy. So if you're trying to do research on something, you'll intrinsically be biased on your own. Oh, let's do research about something that's there, and then it'll help the political to gain their political movement or achieve whatever goal they have. So that's an inherent bias that we'd have, and one might not be able to do research on what he wants to do.
Yeah.
Then
Yeah. Read the Stefan Durkon article. There'll be other people much smarter than me or in the School of Education who can answer that. My take on it, for what it's worth, is that there's like a line that you have to try and figure out, right, between what you think as a researcher is perhaps more like what are perhaps, like I was saying about the topics, what are the right things that you might want to research, and what you think might be the most impactful. And those two things might not always be the same, right? Like the evidence around how we should improve education is like, there's so much about how we might improve teacher training, or we might improve early years learning and stuff. If that's not a policymaker priority or something, then you have to ask yourself, okay, if I'm really committed to those areas, then I've got to research that. But you might have to be prepared for it not to be well received, right? Or not really listened to. You can choose another thing. What are they interested in? At the moment, everyone just talks about AI, right? All the time, every meeting. And you could say, okay, well, we'll come along and we'll do a policy brief on how AI is best used sensibly around the world. What they best do. You might get more reception for that, but it's not on the topic. So it's a continuum, and where you choose and where your priorities are and your ethics are and what you want to do depends on where you would sit on that continuum. Sorry, that's a bit of a vague answer, but it's a good question. Does anyone else, like, by the way, if you guys want to come in at any point, just like let me know. These guys know a lot more than me about these things.
Yes, please.
Directed research and like finding overlaps between government policies and our own research, don't you think that that would sort of stifle innovation because you're going after more politically suitable ideas and you're not really going for the creative ones? So you can't really find creative breakthroughs or
Hmm. Hmm, 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 hmm. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, right? So in a good functioning system, you kind of want all of it, right? Like, and perhaps a role like a university where that's outside of government more, that has more political independence and that has the ability to suggest innovations and new ideas might be better placed. All I'm saying is, like, from our perspective, we're in the federal ministry, right? So we have certain constraints between like what we can and can't read. Like we're trying to do our best to impact the kind of the government's programs with the research, but I'm not saying that there shouldn't be research on innovations and things. I agree with you. And that's why I mentioned the Peru example as something that we're not doing per se, or Tahir and Jabi's example, we're not doing, but it's really interesting because they put out tenders for innovations in Peru. So they say, we've got X amount of money, we want this year 5 new innovations for how you're going to improve teaching. And then cool companies come up, or technological firms, or good ideas come up, and then they help those companies to work with the government to embed those in. So yeah, no, I think there's a lot of room for innovations, and we shouldn't, I'm not just saying we should just research whatever the government's doing, but I'm saying that there are ways in which you can choose certain areas of what the government wants to do as a crossover point, like I was saying, between what really should be researched and what you think and what their priorities are.
I guess, yes.
Yeah, okay. So my question was more around the fact that in contexts where there is a sense of, a sense or respect for knowledge, epistemic justice, how do you ensure that the research that we're doing, it's actually from, let's just say if it is on some marginalized community, it actually caters to their lived realities and not something that is politically accepted or just something that is politically relevant or in the favor, because these two things can be really, I think, in polarities in most of the cases. The research that will arise, the data that we would procure might be very strong contrast with the reality that we want to accept politically. So how do you operationalize that?
Good question. Hmm. So, I mean, I think Zainab will cover a little bit of this in describing the experience that we had. And one of the things that comes to my mind, and I'm no expert on this by any means, right, but is one that you have to retain your ethics as researchers, even when you're working with the government, right? Like, I think what we're not saying is that just because we are working with the government that we that we feel like we should misrepresent things or misrepresent communities. I think we take that like really seriously about how we ensure that, for example, teachers' voices are heard. In policymaker circles, we see our researchers actually trying to like build bridges between communities that might not be heard necessarily all of the time and policymakers, right? Like the fact that when we're doing surveys of teachers, when we're going into speaking to parents in like early childhood education centers and things like that. I think part of the reason for doing that is because we feel that sort of inclusive approach to hearing those voices needs to be heard in policymaker circles. If your point is kind of saying how do you resist the pressure from government to skew the findings, or perhaps not to look at issues of equity, or maybe not to look at challenging environments, I think those pressures are there, and I think again, I like as in terms of our work, I feel like we've tried very hard to avoid that and represent that, but I don't want to say that those issues don't exist. I think it's more difficult. It's easier for us in some ways because we are an externally funded external program, right? Like we're like a donor project, right? So we are able, and we're external consultants effectively. So we're able to step out of the program and say, we're not going to be put under pressure, for example, to ignore rural children, or we are deliberately going to go and research marginalized communities or refugee communities or whatever it is. I think where that becomes more of a problem is if there's like an embedded government department, or if there's a government department staffed with government people who might be put under much more pressure to produce results and findings that are favorable. But that's a big and different question, but it's a really good point. I hope I kind of answered that all right.
Yeah,
I feel like I kind of
Yes, thank you so much,
waffled.
students. Also, we have like at 5:10 we have networking, and you can ask the questions there. So moving on to Dr. Zainab, I would really wanted to, because we have been talking a whole lot about politics and policy making and decision making. I want you to understand about the ground reality of the research, especially when an intervention is being done, then the next phase is about assessment of that intervention, right? So if Dr. Zainab, you can go through regarding maybe some of the challenges that actually happen on the ground.
Thank you, Fatma, and I'm really honored to be here. Thank you, Dr. Taiba, to faculty members at LUMS, and of course, students here who've come here to listen to us, and we are also here to respond to your queries and to learn from you. So you're all here. I don't know if, am I audible? So you're all here, you're all students, some are in the master's program, some are in the MPhil program. Tomorrow, you will be done with your degrees, you'll step out in the professional world. Some of you will join the private sector, others will probably head towards the public sector like we are doing. And when you head to the public sector, you might learn, because you have that researcher's lens. And when you head there, you might learn through your experience that sometimes the government or the public sector is not receptive to research. And if tomorrow you are contracted by the Punjab government to, let's say, to research, the FLN camps for out-of-school children, or the Happy Learning Hour, how would you go about it? So we thought, since we've been through this experience of working with the government, and tomorrow you will be stepping into that domain, we wanted to make this talk useful for you as practitioners and education leaders. So I want to share some of the aspects that we consider when we conduct research in the public domain, and something that you can be mindful of or take into consideration. And I'm hoping that some of these aspects can answer some of the questions that were posed. So one is how to choose a relevant topic when you are sitting in a public domain. What is a wise way of doing it? I think it's very important. What we've learned from our experience is to choose the topic strategically. Be very strategic about the topic that you choose. A topic that aligns with your academic interests, but at the same time, it also has some kind of a policy relevance. So for example, I'm going to use our most recently launched research report, which is starting early evaluation of the Ministry of Education's 100 early childhood education centers. This was recently launched. In fact, this very month it was launched. And I'm going to use this as a case study throughout my talk to give you examples of how we went about it. So this particular topic is valuable from two contexts. One, it fits in well with the PFL Hub's mandate. Our mandate is to provide evidence-based research to policymakers in the area of foundational learning and early childhood development. So when this topic, when this initiative or this project was presented to us, it provided us a valuable opportunity. And two, from a policymaker's lens, this particular project at this moment in time enjoys high visibility. This is a project that was initiated by the former federal secretary, and obviously, early childhood is also a domain that this is a new initiative that has come into the public domain, where, if you look at the policy, we don't have a specific policy covering children 3 to 5 years of age. So this is something that is a pioneer project, and it presented a valuable opportunity for us to look at it from that perspective. So when you choose a topic in the public domain, it should be aligned with your own academic interests, so that you don't compromise on that aspect, but at the same time, see how it resonates with policymakers. Is it timely? Is it actionable? And if it is a current ongoing project, then it will also give you opportunities to gain institutional support. By institutional support, I mean since it is being initiated by the government, that institutional support will be there for you to enter into the research site. That's very important. You will have access to existing data as much as possible, and you will have an opportunity to work collaboratively with the stakeholders. So keep all these aspects in mind. If we go to the next slide, another very important aspect to consider as okay. Right. Another very important aspect to consider, and I think we received a question also from the audience about the timing and responsiveness. It's also something that Sam highlighted. The timing is very, very important in a policy arena. And why do you think that is? Because moments come in time, an event happens, there's expediency, and suddenly, a certain topic or a certain issue is highlighted. And if you strike the iron while it's hot, then you have a greater chance of enhancing the impact of your research. So for example, in our case, we were asked by the former federal secretary, and like Sam said, the federal secretaries change quite regularly, but we were asked by the federal secretary to conduct an evaluation of the early childhood centers. These are 100 early childhood education centers that have been implemented across Islamabad. And this project came into being, it was implemented in 2024 at an operational cost of more than 900 million. So this project enjoys a lot of, at this point in time, visibility. So we responded, the PFL Hub saw it as an opportunity because it aligned with our own research goals, early childhood, early learning, and again, it was of interest to policymakers. We immediately responded to that request. Another direct request came from the project director of this initiative. So based on that, we immediately responded to this request, and we conducted this research because we wanted to contribute to a culture of openness, to feedback, and evidence within the government. What did we do? So if you look at our outcomes, the findings, if you look at our findings and our outcomes, so we provided formative input to policymakers. We provided evidence to refine strategies, to reallocate resources and address emerging gaps while the project is still alive. So that is very important. To evaluate a project in the government while a project is still alive and kicking. If a project closes down and you conduct an evaluation, there will be a very little probability of the findings being taken up because the project is closed down. They've moved on. But the fact that this project is still alive, we came at a strategic moment in time. Only one academic year of the project cycle has been completed, and there is one more year to go. So we are giving them space, and we are giving them time to act on the recommendations and the findings. But as students of education and research, we also need to keep in mind that the picture is not always so rosy. Sometimes we do not have the luxury of choosing a project at the right time. For example, if left to us, we would have liked to come into this project even earlier. Even though this is a strategic moment, but we would have liked to come into it much earlier, maybe at the beginning, where we could also influence the EC management to conduct a baseline. That is something we found was missing in this project. No baseline had been captured in terms of a baseline assessment of children. If we move to the next aspect. Another important thing to consider is, and that's again something that Sam touched upon, building a consistent relationship with gatekeepers to facilitate research. This is key. As researchers, as scholars, if you do not build a relationship with your gatekeepers, and in the case of our current study, who were the gatekeepers? It was the senior EC management, the project director. So for example, I'll tell you what we did. We started building a relationship with her 2 months in advance before data collection actually began. How did we go about it? We kept an open and regular line of communication through regular meetings, in-person meetings. We had a WhatsApp group where we used to communicate with the project director directly. We exchanged constant emails. We kept the project director, updated about the project. The project director also made a request to us that she wanted all kinds of communication flowing to her and from her. So if you have the gatekeeper there, you have to respect. You, as researchers, we need to respect the gatekeeper's vision and their expectations, and that's something we try to maintain throughout the 6 months that we worked with her. Other than that, we try to build buy-in by actively involving the EC management in shaping and influencing the scope of the study, the scope of the research. So initially, we started off very broad, and we came with our vision, but we sat with the project director, and we asked her what her vision was. When we did that, it was a way of showing respect to the project director, and she shared with us that she wanted us to look at whether her children are learning, whether those children in the 100 EC centers are actually learning after that first academic year has gone by. So based on that exchange, we revised the research questions, but at the same time, we did not compromise on areas that we wanted to research. And along with that, we added 2 more research questions, which is we wanted to look at the quality of the learning environment in these EC centers. And third, very important for us, was we also wanted to look at the ecosystem surrounding the learning, which is what aspects are facilitating or impeding the learning process. That was very important for us to see. And we also assured her throughout this process how important the findings would be in supporting or in strengthening her efforts. So that built-in, that buy-in is very important in keeping the relationship with her consistent. The impact and the result of that was that, quite honestly, I have to tell you, throughout the 6 months that we were, in the process of collecting data, interacting with them, and sometimes it's not easy doing that because in the public sector, processes are not as smooth. The data is not how you want it to be. It's usually it's not digitized, it's paper-based. There's a lot of struggle and you have to work with them. But despite that, our biggest champion was the project director who, any challenges we faced, she was there to support us, to provide the data to us, to ask her teachers and her mentors to enter data, at the 11th hour. So it's very important for you to realize that the gatekeeper will give you access to the research site, will give you access to the teachers, to the students, to important resources. And that relationship needs to be built. Next. So in the public sector, research often unfolds in very complex and unpredictable ways. And why is that? I'm sorry, just take a water break.
Sure. Regarding what we are discussing right now, Dr. Zainab, so is government sector also something like in terms of line of management? For instance, someone gave you the green sheet that you can go into that field, you can collect the data.
Yes.
But after going there, you got to know that such message was not being communicated, or who communicated to you that. So maybe did you have certain challenges as well? Different people said different things, and
So we didn't experience it to that extent because we, from the word go, built a very strong relationship with the project director. I just wanted to share with you that in this project, there was an education service provider who was in partnership with the EC management, and they provide support in terms of mentoring and training and the learning aspect. So in terms of communicating with them, the project director had told us had requested that from the word go, even if we have to communicate with them, it should be through her. We respected that, since that is something, that is the only thing she was, she was particular about. And based on that, communication more or less flowed, easily. So we did not experience that. I don't know, Shayan, would you like to come into this? Do you recall Shayan was also a part of the research process? So
Yeah, it helped having built that relationship up front, and we respected her request to go through her even if it took us extra time at most points, but following the rules that she had set out actually worked out well for us.
Also, like, how difficult is it to get access to the field? For instance, I remember I worked at a government level, but it was a small project in prison education. So I had to complete my work in 4 months, but it took 2 months alone for just getting access to the field. So maybe if you can shed some light on that, getting access to actually the field to collect the data,
yes.
even if you have been communicating with the person who is
Right.
actually controlling all that.
So my next point will actually touch upon it. If we go back to the point about methodology and opting for a methodology that caters to the ground realities. So often the research that we work on can unfold, especially in the public sector, in very unpredictable ways, because sometimes the processes are not what they should be. So based on the ground realities, it's very important that the methodology that we design should be rigorous, but at the same time, it should be flexible and it should be context sensitive. How did we go about it? As I've already shared with you, we revised our initial research questions based on the ground realities, based on the vision of the project director and the expectations of the project director, and of course, based on what we wanted to study. But along with that, we also revised the methodology to quite an extent. What we did was that we wanted to look at, ideally, we wanted to sort of administer independent assessments of these children. But owing to time constraints, human resource constraints, we could not do that. What was the next step that we could take? What was the other option? The other option was that we could look at the existing assessments that were there for their bi-monthlies and their final assessments of children who were a part of the early childhood education classrooms for the first grade before they graduated to the second term. The gaps in those assessments, as I've already shared with you, were many. One was that it looked at students' scores cumulatively, collectively. For example, we were able to derive a total score for children, for a child in math, Urdu, and English. But what we wanted to see at a deeper level were the cognitive, the cognitive domains, the micro-cognitive domains. For example, within English, how are these children doing in terms of recognizing sound and letter? How are these children doing in terms of forming words? One letter word, one word formations. How are they doing in terms of oral communication? The data that they were collecting did not sort of, come to that level where we could look at it from that lens. So what was the option that we had, other than the fact that we reviewed 2,072 assessments, existing assessments of these children, where we were able to derive, get a sense of how children are doing in terms of math, science, and English, and the results showed positive outcomes that, almost all the children were scoring above 70%. But we decided to sort of strengthen the validity of our findings and to address some of these gaps by going into these classrooms and observing these classrooms and actually seeing how the learning is taking place in that space. So initially, our decision was to add, to do classroom observations in 10 schools, but later on then we expanded to 20 schools. And this covered a period of 2 weeks. This opportunity gave us a holistic understanding of how these children are doing. And one of our outcomes is that where the academic outcomes are really high and they're encouraging, but when we actually went and observed these children inside the classrooms, we learned that the conceptual understanding is not where it should be. And where the academic outcomes are concerned, they are high. The sense was that they are more or less related to short recall, rote memorization, because that is something that we were seeing in the classrooms. There was a lot of chanting going on, there was, recitations going on, but where you actually sit down with these children and you explain concepts to them, and the comprehension, improve their comprehension levels, that's something we did not observe in the classroom. So that's a lens that we were given when we actually went and we observed the learning process. Other than that, we also sort of revised the classroom observation tool. We did some initial visits to these classrooms before we actually started collecting the data. And based on what we saw, we revised the items, we revised the scoring. So that's something as researchers you will need to do. It's very important that before you go into the research site, and I have to be thankful because you said that, what problems did you face? We did not face any problems in accessing those sites. We were allowed to go into those, early childhood centers prior to the data collection process. So we picked 4 or 5 EC centers where we piloted our tools. We actually went and we piloted our classroom observation tool, and we piloted our CEL tool, which is the social and emotional learning tool. Based on the pilot, we revised these tools. So for example, in the CEL tool, we added more emotions and feelings because we wanted to gauge whether these children are actually are able to recognize sadness, happiness, anger. So this is very important, that you remain flexible, that rigor should be there with regard to your methodology, but remain flexible. Be ready to, adapt your tools according to the ground realities. Our next aspect is, so this is something that I think we all face, not just in the public sector, but also in the private sector, stakeholders' apprehensions about being evaluated. But this is more so in the public sector. And why is that? Because in the public sector, there is more, there is more visibility. There is more of a spotlight. The press can be there, during a launch. So those stakeholders, program or project heads feel that they're under scrutiny. And this is something that we felt the moment we started the data, even before we started the data collection process. I mentioned that we had the education service providers. And we sensed right from the word go, when we started having those conversations with them, that they felt threatened, as if they were being evaluated. And I think we talked about pressures over here. And we did also experience those pressures. We were asked, for example, when we presented a list of randomly sampled, list of schools that were randomly sampled, and we presented a list to the management that these are the schools we want to go to. We were requested by the education service provider to drop a few schools because they felt they were not up to the mark, and they felt, it would sort of impact the findings, or how, we evaluated their performance. But that's something we withheld. Again, we were able to hold back on that, and we went ahead with the schools that we, randomly sampled. How do you address that? How do you address this, and how do you help sort of address those apprehensions? Is something, what we did was, and we can share, we triangulated. Yeah, so what we did was we used triangulation. We collected data from multiple sources and methods to cross-verify findings. We assured them of confidentiality and anonymity, the research participants. We assured them that whatever data was collected, it would not be identified to them. We also told them there are no right or wrong answers. It's their opinion, their beliefs, and they should honestly share whatever they can. And we also kept, driving to them that their contribution is very meaningful for the project that they're doing and for the children that they are serving. So that helped to mitigate or address some of the fears that they had. Can we move to the sixth aspect? So now that the data collection is done, you have the data, you've analyzed the data, you have the report in your hand. What do you do? In a government domain, what do you do? How do you disseminate the findings? In a public setup, in a private sector, you can just do it quietly. Or if you want, you can invite people. But in a public sector, while I think Fatma talked about political sensitivities, and that's something we are all, aware of. But at this, yeah.
Also, if you can talk about the language,
Absolutely.
the key aspect in which the report be communicated to the policymakers, and also to different stakeholders. In this point, I am sure you will going to cover.
Sorry, so a soft reminder because it is 5 and we need to leave some room for people to ask questions.
Yes.
Okay, so maybe 3 more minutes?
Yes, we just have 5 more minutes. Okay. So basically what we did was we conducted a public launch. We invited the Minister of State for Education. We also invited important policymakers. And why did we do that? Because we had practitioners from the development sector, policymakers, people in corridors of power under one roof in the same space to focus on very important aspects. And the result was, for example, we highlighted issues such as the dearth of books and sustainability issues. What was the impact of that? The impact of that was that right after the launch, some meaningful conversations happened regarding plans for the sustainability of the project. So this is very important. And then if we talk about the tone, and that's something I'll cover later, if we move to the next slide. I think this is something that came up a lot, how to remain transparent in an environment where we are evaluating a government project while we are working from within. We are working from within the government. So one, from the word go, we clearly defined our evaluation plan. Secondly, we stuck to random sampling, and even though we received a lot of pressure, we included an independent team of internal and external reviewers who had that objective lens to look at our report, and then we collected data in as objective a way as possible. And obviously, we don't have the time to go into it, but there were various steps that we took. We had to standardize the data collection process and to make adjustments. But if we go to the next slide, we will talk about the tone and the language of the research report. So when you write a report in the public sector for assessing a public project, what is the tone that you need to adopt? So there is a kind of a conflict where you have to navigate between two different expectations. One expectation is, of course, from the academic community, which focuses on transparency, on honest kind of a feedback, where you report everything without dilution. And the other aspect is, the other element is obviously the policymakers. So with policymakers, the communication or the tone or the voice has to be clear, it has to be strategic, it has to be evidence-based. But at the same time, it should be constructive and solution-oriented. If it is too critical, it will not be received. It risks not being received at all, or there is a chance that you will get a defensive kind of a response. If it is too positive, and if it ignores the challenges, then it dilutes, it underplays the value of that particular, of the findings. So you have to maintain that kind of a balance. Where the language is concerned, it should not be very technical, because you have, you don't have academia there. You have all kinds of readers. You have people, from the general public, you can have people from the development sector, so the jargon should not be very technical. Keep it simple. And then in terms of the research findings and the recommendations, as our policy brief shows you, we also came up with not just the larger study, but we also sort of concise the recommendations into a smaller summary brief. Why is that important? Because policymakers do not have the time to go through a 100-page report. So they have the time to go through a 7 or an 8-page summary and to quickly go through, scan it, and to make any kinds of corrective measures that they want. And finally, our last aspect that we should consider as researchers, as future researchers, is that do not chase for perfection. As difficult as it is for me to not chase for perfection, this is something one learns through the process, because in the public arena, things happen, you plan a certain way, and things don't happen as you plan them. So be ready to switch plans. Be ready to tweak your research tools according to the ground realities, and be flexible about adjusting your timelines, as long as you remain true to the integrity of your research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zainab Salim. Any questions regarding the research? Yes.
Yeah. So I'll bring in my research team to respond to that, my quantitative research team. But very briefly, we adapted the IDELA tool, classroom observation tool, and that's a tool that is available for classroom observations. But again, like I mentioned, we went into these classrooms before collecting data. We tweaked them according to the ground realities, and we measured the learning and the learning environment. Basically, we were looking at the learning environment in those classrooms, and it had a number of items, like around 49, 50 items. And Alberto, would you like to go deeper into that? And Cheyenne, maybe you can sort of respond to.
I mean, some of the aspects that this tool measured, um, well, this measure kind of used like a ranking system, right? So like it will tell you, are the books available in the class, yes or not, and then you will get a value, a numeric value based on that. Is the teacher bringing in those students that belong to minority backgrounds, and then based on the kind of attitudes of the teacher that you observe, you give them a score. Yes, sometimes, always, sometimes, never. So like it does follow quite a straightforward format that allow us to like divide the tool into different topics. So like availability of materials, are the materials being used, are they relevant? What is the classroom? Is the classroom clean? Is it safe? Does it have like materials in the walls, learning materials?
And also questions about the pedagogy. Is the language being used?
Yes, exactly. And
Are the
it
learning
just-
corners being used?
and the person, I mean the evaluator had to give like a score. Normally it's a score from 1 to 3 or 1 to 5, and based on that score you basically can get a numeric value. And normally what we did is we went in pairs to do these observations, and normally what we observed is that the responses that one of the persons doing the observations was quite the same as the other person. So it was quite robust. What is quite a robust indicator in that sense.
Because we also received, all the observers received training from an early childhood specialist also. So more or less they were on the same page, and they went through a rigorous training process.
With regards to your question in terms of what is a good class and what it is not, it was one of our biggest challenges here. We relied basically on the experience of a PhD student from Oxford University who has done a very similar research in Karachi. So she will actually tell us like what should be the levels of that we should be expecting in these classrooms. So we were using that kind of comparison. But again, it does depend from scenario to scenario, right? So, yeah. But if you had a score of 0, like it was the case of book availability in the classrooms, then that for sure was a bad indicator. Well, like if you had a score of 3 out of 3, like we had, I think it was in use of inclusively, no,
Availability of teaching and learning materials,
yeah,
learning partners.
exactly. So we had like certain things that were 3 out of things, so like that was a really good score, right?
Also, I believe the report is available online in the
Yes.
PDF form. So there is methodology section there as well. You can go through that at your pace as well. Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
Um, so I just want to start with, it was a really insightful session. Thank you so much. But my question was, you've mentioned a lot of political barriers. And I'm going to ask, did you face any social barriers? And this comes from, you mentioned that the grades of the students you were looking at, they were above 70%. And I would assume at that point, teachers wouldn't care, or parents even wouldn't care. I think as a society, we care more about grades than actual comprehension. So was there a moment where the parents or the teachers or the students even, they didn't really care if they weren't actually learning, or they didn't care about what you were trying to fix?
So, we held focus group discussions. We surveyed the teachers. We held focus group discussions with all, 39 to 40 teachers who were a part of, who were working in those 20 schools. The sense that we got was that they were committed, but there were certain constraints. The major constraint in these EC centers was the time factor and the fact that they were the structure of these EC centers. There was a double shift. If you look at an ideal early childhood, learning space, normally the time is much longer. It's a longer period. If you look at international best practices, like roughly 8 to 3. In Pakistan, obviously, it's a very costly venture. It's a very, very costly venture, and it's a new initiative. So that seemed to be a struggle. The fact that in the morning they used to have EC1 classes for roughly 2.5 to 3 hours, and then there was hardly any break for the teacher, and then they immediately gravitate towards EC2. EC2 children used to start coming. So the time barrier, based on that, what we saw was that very little play-based activity was going on. And in these spaces, it's more or less about self-directed learning, Montessori, play-based activity. Those learning corners were there. The infrastructure was there. It's a beautiful, beautiful setup, even more impressive than some of the private centers that you could have visited. But where the pedagogy was concerned, there is a lot that was left to be desired. Where the social aspect is concerned, I think the inclusive aspect, I think we did come across that aspect in a few classrooms. It was reported during the observations where we had minority children. Children, 2 or 3 schools, there were children from a minority community. I'm not going to mention the name of the community, but so certain, I think the way the teacher talked about those children is something, or addressed those children, indirectly when she was talking to the observers. That was something that I think it requires a lot of training in terms of for the teachers to be more inclusive in their conversations or in the way that they address those children. Another aspect that observers highlighted was when they were talking about children who were underperforming, because in a class you have high performing children, you have mid performing children and underperforming children. And the way they talked about those children in their presence, where those children were listening to them being called, what was the term? They were being called, they were being labeled as underperforming. So those are areas that need further training, further capacity building.
Just one thing I just add to that. The report comes out with one finding that's quite, not what you'd expect. Actually, a lot of rural schools and rural areas actually outperforming urban ones. I'm sure you know Islamabad, but particularly the urban areas tend to be better off. The schools perform better in the urban areas. The rural areas are usually very different. But we found that the rural areas sometimes do better. Sometimes the parents there and the enrollments there in the rural areas are much greater than the urban areas. So there's perhaps something going on there about being very sort of grateful, potentially really hungry and eager to avail themselves of the programs in those more rural areas.
So I'm so sorry to interrupt. Maybe we move towards tea because the time is up. It was 5:10 and we need to move towards the tea. And maybe questions can be asked over there. Okay, please join us. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sam, Wilson, Dr. Zainab, your team. It's really great to have you. I'm so sorry because other people are also
Can I just
waiting
say,
outside for us,
if
so
you
we
want to
need
look
to
at the
finish on
research,
time.
you can go on our website, pflhub.com. Our contact details are also there, so if any of you have questions that we haven't managed to
join us for
answer,
tea.
you can reach out to us there, and we're happy to